To his neighbors, he was just Frank, the quiet guy who kept to himself, never complained about noise, always waved politely from his porch. His mailbox said, F. Morrison, no rank, no title, no hint of his past. The retirement checks came to a P.O. box downtown. The medals stayed locked in a safe he'd never opened for visitors. For 15 years, Frank had worked very hard to be invisible, ordinary, forgettable. But some nights, when the wrong people chose the wrong house, invisible wasn't an option anymore. Welcome to Faces Behind Stories. Before we begin this intense story of hidden identity and deadly consequences, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. Maple Street was the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever happened. Tree-lined sidewalks, modest homes with well-maintained gardens, and the sort of peaceful atmosphere where children rode bikes and elderly couples walked their dogs at sunset. Frank Morrison's house sat at the end of the street, a simple ranch-style home with beige siding where he'd lived for 15 years. To everyone who knew him, Frank was the perfect neighbor. Quiet, polite, helpful when needed, but never intrusive. He mowed his lawn every Saturday morning at exactly 8 a.m., the sound of his old pushmower becoming part of the neighborhood's weekend rhythm. He retrieved his mail at 3 p.m. sharp, always exchanging pleasantries with Mrs. Patterson next door. Every night at 10 p.m., his porch light went off like clockwork. The neighborhood kids knew him as the nice old man who gave out full-size candy bars on Halloween and never yelled when their baseball went into his yard. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow next door, knew him as the thoughtful gentleman who shoveled her driveway every winter without being asked. The young couple across the street knew him as the helpful guy who'd spent an entire Saturday helping them move their couch when they'd first bought their house. What none of them knew was that Frank Morrison wasn't just any retiree. They didn't know that his slight limp was from a rocky shrapnel that had missed his femoral artery by 2 millimeters during a convoy ambush in 2003. They didn't know that the reason he always positioned himself with his back to walls at neighborhood barbecues was pure muscle memory from 22 years of military service. They didn't know his reading glasses were actually equipped with night vision capability, or that his walking cane contained a 12-inch steel blade that could be deployed in under 2 seconds. And they definitely didn't know that Master Chief Petty Officer Franklin James Morrison, retired Navy SEAL Team 6, had participated in over 200 combat missions across 4 different theaters of operation, with a confirmed kill count that was classified at a level requiring congressional approval to access. Frank had worked very hard to keep it that way. After 2 decades of being one of the most dangerous men on the planet, he'd wanted nothing more than to disappear into suburban anonymity. He'd chosen Maple Street specifically because it was quiet, safe, and predictable. The kind of place where the biggest excitement was usually the annual block party in September. For 15 years, it had been exactly what he'd wanted. He'd read books on his porch, tended a small vegetable garden behind his house, watched old movies on quiet Saturday nights, and slowly convinced himself that Master Chief Morrison was someone he used to be, not someone he still was. He'd almost succeeded in forgetting the weight of night vision goggles, the sound of helicopter rotors, the feeling of sand between his teeth during desert operations. Almost. But some skills once learned never really fade. They just wait, dormant, until the moment they're needed again. The 3 men sitting in the stolen Honda Civic parked 2 blocks away had been watching Frank's house for 6 weeks. They'd made it their business to study the rhythms of Maple Street with the kind of methodical patience that comes from years of successful burglaries. Tommy Spider Castellano was the planner, a thin man in his early 30s with nervous energy and a genuine talent for case studies. He'd researched every house on Maple Street through public records, social media, and old-fashioned surveillance. Frank Morrison's house had checked every box on Spider's target list: single elderly occupant, no obvious security systems, valuable neighborhood suggesting disposable income, and a location that offered multiple escape routes. Marcus Big Mike Williams was the muscle, a former high school football player who'd traded his athletic potential for a criminal record spanning 12 years. At 6'4" and 260 pounds, he was the one who kicked in doors, intimidated residents, and handled any physical resistance they might encounter. In his experience, most homeowners became very cooperative very quickly once they got a good look at him. Carlos Mendez, at 24, was the youngest of the three and served as both driver and lookout. He was fast, smart, and had developed an instinct for danger that had kept all three of them out of prison longer than any of them had a right to expect. They'd chosen Frank's house for all the right reasons and all the wrong ones. Yes, he lived alone. Yes, he appeared to be elderly and possibly frail. Yes, the house was positioned perfectly with excellent sightlines and multiple escape routes. And yes, their research had indicated that F. Morrison's only obvious source of income was government retirement benefits. What their research hadn't shown them was the specific nature of those retirement benefits. Public records listed Frank as a former government employee, which could mean anything from postal worker to DMV clerk. His service record was classified above Spider's amateur hacking abilities. His medical records were sealed behind privacy laws. They'd made assumptions based on incomplete intelligence. They'd observed an old man occasionally struggling with heavy grocery bags and assumed physical weakness. They'd noted his solitary lifestyle and assumed social isolation meant vulnerability. They'd cataloged his modest home and modest car and assumed limited resources meant an easy target. They'd been watching Frank Morrison for 6 weeks, but they'd never really seen him at all. At exactly 10:47 p.m., the three men exited their vehicle 2 blocks away and approached Frank's house on foot, moving with the practiced silence of experienced criminals. They wore dark clothing, soft-soled shoes, and had rehearsed this particular approach dozens of times over the past month. Carlos remained at the corner as lookout, positioned to watch for late-night dog walkers, insomniacs, or patrol cars, while Spider and Big Mike made their way through the shadows to the back of Frank's property. Frank's backyard was exactly what they had expected from their surveillance: small, neat, unremarkable. A few raised garden beds where he grew tomatoes and peppers, a modest patio with a single chair where he sometimes sat with his morning coffee, and sliding glass doors that looked like they hadn't been updated since the house was built. Spider produced a small crowbar and a roll of duct tape, while Big Mike pulled on latex gloves and checked the tactical flashlight clipped to his belt. "Remember," Spider whispered, his voice barely audible. "Quiet and quick. Old man's probably a heavy sleeper, but no reason to take chances." What they didn't know was that Frank Morrison hadn't been a heavy sleeper since 1987, when his first combat deployment had taught him that the difference between light sleeping and death was often measured in milliseconds. They didn't know that he'd heard their car doors close from 2 blocks away, or that he'd been tracking their approach through the network of small, nearly invisible security cameras he'd installed around his property. They also didn't know that Frank was already awake, already dressed in dark tactical clothing, and already armed with weapons they couldn't have imagined finding in a suburban home. The sliding door gave way to Spider's crowbar with barely a whisper of sound. The lock was old, the frame was wood, and Spider had years of experience with exactly this type of entry. Big Mike stepped through first, flashlight ready but not yet activated, moving with surprising grace for such a large man. The house was dark, quiet, and peaceful in a way that should have been reassuring. But it wasn't. Big Mike had broken into dozens of homes over the years, and he developed an almost supernatural instinct for occupied spaces. Houses with sleeping people inside had a particular feel to them. The subtle sounds of breathing, the slight warmth of body heat, the almost imperceptible sense of life being lived. This house felt different. It felt empty, abandoned, like a movie set waiting for actors. "Something's not right," he whispered to Spider, who was already inside and moving toward what their surveillance had identified as the master bedroom. "Cold feet?" Spider replied softly, but there was tension in his voice too. "Old man's probably just a quiet sleeper. Let's get this done and get out." They made their way through the house with practiced silence, flashlight beams dancing across walls lined with bookshelves and modest furniture. The living room contained exactly what they had expected: an old leather couch, a television that had seen better days, reading lamps, and side tables covered with the kind of accumulated clutter that builds up in homes where people live alone. What they didn't expect was the complete and total absence of the homeowner. The master bedroom was empty. Not just unoccupied, empty in a way that suggested it had been abandoned in a deliberate hurry. The bed was made with military precision, corners sharp enough to cut paper, but there was no depression in the pillow, no sign that anyone had been sleeping there recently. "Where the hell is he?" Big Mike whispered, his flashlight beam sweeping across the sterile room with increasing urgency. Spider was beginning to feel the first stirrings of genuine unease. In 11 previous burglaries, they'd never encountered an empty house during what should have been prime sleeping hours. Maybe he's not here. Maybe he went out of town or something. The lights were on schedule. The car's in the driveway. His mail hasn't piled up. Where the hell could he be? That's when they heard the voice from behind them, calm and conversational, as if they were old friends who'd just dropped by for coffee. "Gentlemen, I think you may be looking for me." Both men spun around to find Frank Morrison standing in the doorway, hands visible and empty, wearing jeans and a simple gray t-shirt. He looked exactly like what he was supposed to be, a harmless old man who'd been awakened by strange noises in his house. Big Mike's relief was immediate and obvious. "Thank God. Thought we were going to have to hunt for you all night." He stepped forward, his size and presence filling the room. "Here's how this works, old man. You do exactly what we say. Nobody gets hurt. We tie you up, take a few things, and we're gone before you know it." Frank nodded politely as if Big Mike had just explained the weather forecast. "I see. And if I don't cooperate?" "Then things get unpleasant real quick," Big Mike replied, pulling out a pair of zip ties. "But you seem like a smart guy. I'm betting you'll make the right choice." Frank appeared to consider this for a moment, then nodded again. "You know what? You're absolutely right. I am going to make the right choice." The room exploded into motion so fast that neither criminal had time to process what was happening. Frank moved like water, like lightning, like something that existed between one heartbeat and the next. Big Mike, who outweighed him by 80 pounds and had 6 inches of reach advantage, found himself on the floor with a dislocated shoulder and a broken nose before he even realized the old man had moved. Spider tried to run, but running requires space and time, 2 things that Frank Morrison no longer allowed him to have. A hand closed around his throat with the precision of a surgical instrument and the force of a hydraulic press. The last thing Spider saw before consciousness left him was a pair of eyes that held no anger, no emotion at all, just the cold, professional calculation of a man who'd done this kind of thing so many times that it had become routine. Frank zip-tied both men to chairs he dragged in from the kitchen, using the same restraints they'd brought to use on him. He worked methodically, efficiently, checking pulses and pupil responses with the practiced competence of someone who'd interrogated prisoners in considerably less comfortable circumstances. Big Mike regained consciousness first, his broken nose making breathing difficult and his dislocated shoulder sending waves of pain through his entire body. When he saw Frank sitting calmly across from him, reading what appeared to be a newspaper, his first reaction was confusion. What the hell just happened?" Frank looked up from his paper with mild interest. "You broke into my house. I defended myself. Pretty straightforward, really." Spider came around a few minutes later, his throat bruised but functional. Unlike Big Mike, he understood immediately that they'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. The way Frank had moved, the speed and precision of his counterattack, the complete absence of fear or uncertainty, this was someone with training, experience, and skills that went far beyond anything a normal homeowner should possess. "Who are you?" Spider croaked, his voice barely audible through his damaged throat. Frank set down his newspaper and looked at him with something that might have been sympathy. "I'm Frank Morrison. I live here. This is my house, which you broke into, intending to rob me and possibly hurt me in the process." He paused as if considering how much to explain. "The question isn't who I am. The question is whether you understand how badly you've miscalculated." Big Mike tried to struggle against his restraints, but the zip ties were applied with professional competence. "You can't do this. This is kidnapping. When the cops get here." "When the cops get here," Frank interrupted gently, "they're going to find 2 men who broke into my home, armed with crowbars and zip ties, with a long history of similar crimes. They're going to find me, a 67-year-old retiree who defended himself against home invaders. How do you think that conversation is going to go?" Frank stood up and walked to the window, peering out at the quiet street. "Here's what I think happened. You watched my house, did some basic research, and decided I looked like an easy target. Elderly, living alone. No obvious security measures. You probably figured you could be in and out in 15 minutes with whatever cash and jewelry you could find. Spider nodded reluctantly. There was no point in denying the obvious. The problem is that your research was incomplete. You didn't know who you were really dealing with. Frank walked to a cabinet in the corner of the room and opened it, revealing something that made both criminals' blood run cold. Inside was an arsenal that belonged in a military compound, not a suburban home. Handguns, rifles, tactical gear, and equipment they couldn't even identify, all arranged with the same obsessive precision as the rest of the house. Master Chief Petty Officer Franklin Morrison, United States Navy SEALs, retired. 22 years of active duty, most of it classified. I've been in situations where 3 armed men breaking into my living space would have been considered a light Tuesday evening. The color drained from Spider's face. Big Mike's struggles against his restraints stopped completely. Frank selected a pistol and checked its condition with practiced ease. Now, I have a choice to make. I can call the police right now, have you arrested, and let the justice system handle this. Given your criminal records, and yes, I know all about your criminal records, you'll probably be looking at significant prison time. He paused, letting that sink in. Or I can handle this myself. And trust me, gentlemen, you don't want me to handle this myself. 20 minutes later, all 3 criminals were zip-tied to chairs in Frank's living room, staring at a man who'd systematically dismantled their entire operation without breaking a sweat. Carlos had walked into the house expecting to help carry stolen goods to the car. Instead, he'd found himself face down on the carpet with his arms secured behind his back before he'd even had time to ask what was wrong. Frank had called the police, but not immediately. First, he'd spent some time gathering information. The 3 men had been responsible for 11 home invasions over the past 2 years, targeting elderly residents across 3 different counties. They had detailed files on dozens of potential future victims, and they'd been escalating. The last 2 burglaries had involved physical violence when homeowners had resisted. You know what the really sad part is? Frank asked, organizing the criminals' notebooks and surveillance photos into neat piles. You actually did good research. You watched my house, learned my routines, identified potential weaknesses. In a different context, that kind of operational planning might have been impressive. None of the 3 men responded. They were still trying to process what had happened to them. The problem is that you made assumptions based on incomplete intelligence. You saw what I wanted you to see, a harmless old man living a quiet retirement. You never thought to dig deeper, to ask why someone my age was in such good physical condition, or why I moved with a particular kind of awareness, or why I chose to live in a house with such excellent sight lines and multiple exit strategies. Frank's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and nodded. The police will be here in about 5 minutes. Before they arrive, I want you to understand something. This isn't random. This isn't luck. You didn't just happen to choose the wrong house. You chose the only house on this street that belongs to someone who spent 22 years hunting people like you in places where there are no police to call. He leaned forward, and for the first time that night, his voice carried an edge that made all 3 men want to disappear. I know who you are, where you live, who you care about, and what you're afraid of. If any of you ever come near this neighborhood again, if you ever target another elderly homeowner, if you so much as think about committing another burglary, I will find you. And the next time we meet, there won't be any police involved. Do you understand me? All 3 men nodded frantically. The police arrived to find a scene that was both exactly what they expected and completely different from anything they'd encountered before. 3 burglars were secured and waiting for arrest, their tools and evidence neatly organized for collection. The homeowner was calm, cooperative, and had already prepared a detailed statement about the incident. Detective Sarah Chen had been investigating the string of elderly targeted burglaries for 6 months. She'd interviewed victims, analyzed crime scenes, and followed leads that never seemed to go anywhere. Now, in one night, the entire case had been solved by a single homeowner who'd been prepared for exactly this kind of encounter. Mr. Morrison, she said, reviewing his statement, you handled this situation with remarkable composure. Most people would have been terrified. Frank shrugged modestly. Military training, I suppose. Old habits die hard. Military training doesn't usually include advanced interrogation techniques and counter-surveillance operations, Detective Chen observed. What branch did you serve in? Navy, Frank replied, offering no additional details. Detective Chen had dealt with enough veterans to recognize when someone wasn't telling the whole story, but she also knew when not to push. The three criminals were in custody. Evidence had been recovered linking them to multiple previous crimes, and victims would finally get some closure. Well, whatever your background, you've done this community a real service tonight. These three were escalating. The next elderly homeowner they targeted might not have been as fortunate as you were. Frank nodded, accepting the thanks with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout the entire encounter. Just glad I could help. After the police left, Frank stood on his front porch and looked out at Maple Street. Tomorrow, the neighbors would hear about what had happened. There would be questions, curiosity, maybe even some concern about having someone with his particular skill set living next door. But tonight, the street was quiet again. Children would sleep safely in their beds. Elderly residents wouldn't have to worry about becoming targets. And three criminals who'd thought they were predators had learned what it felt like to be prey. Frank Morrison had spent 15 years trying to be just another neighbor on a quiet street. For one night, he'd been forced to remember who he really was. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing. 3 months later, Frank received a letter from the county sheriff's office. The three burglars had pled guilty to multiple charges and were serving sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years. More importantly, their conviction had closed 11 unsolved cases and brought peace of mind to dozens of victims. The neighborhood had asked questions after that night. Mrs. Patterson brought him a casserole and asked if he'd ever been in some kind of special forces. The young couple across the street thanked him for making the neighborhood safer. The kids still knew him as the man who gave out full-size candy bars, but now their parents looked at him with a different kind of respect. Frank had answered everyone's questions politely but vaguely. Just military training became his standard response. But late at night, when the street was quiet and the house was dark, Frank sometimes found himself standing at his window, watching the shadows and listening to the sounds that most people never noticed. Old habits, as he'd told the detective, died hard. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly how it should be. Frank Morrison had learned something important that night. You can take the SEAL out of the Navy, but you can never take the Navy SEAL out of the man. And in a world where predators sometimes came looking for easy prey, having someone like him keeping watch over a quiet street like Maple Street wasn't such a bad thing. Some men retire and fade into obscurity. Others retire and become the kind of guardians that evil never sees coming. Frank Morrison had spent 15 years being invisible. Now he was content to be invisible and vigilant, just another neighbor with a secret, keeping watch over people who didn't even know they needed protecting. He turned off his porch light at exactly 10 p.m., just like always. Some routines, after all, were worth keeping. So now I ask you, have you ever encountered someone who seemed ordinary, unremarkable, maybe even vulnerable, only to discover they were hiding strength and skills you never could have imagined? Someone who'd lived an extraordinary life, but chose to blend into everyday normalcy? Share their story in the comments. Tell us what city you're watching from. And if you think stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the quiet guardians who stand watch in places we'd never expect. Because at the Human Stories, we believe that heroism doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just lives quietly next door, reading the newspaper on the front porch, waving politely to neighbors who have no idea they're being protected by someone who once protected the entire country.